Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we are unpacking an absolutely fascinating 2013 text by Ryuho Okawa called Remote Viewing, The Dark Side of the Moon. We're going to dive into some claims that completely push the boundaries of what we think we know about space exploration and human consciousness. Let's jump right in.
Okay, let's kick things off with a question that totally flips our traditional understanding of space travel upside down. What if you could travel to the surface of the moon in just 30 seconds using absolutely nothing but your mind? I mean, imagine bypassing the massive rockets, the billions of dollars, the decades of planning, and the intense physical risks. The text we are examining today asks us to consider exactly that possibility. It sets this incredibly bold, almost sci-fi mystery tone right out of the gate, and challenges us to just sort of suspend our disbelief for a moment and explore a universe where the human mind itself is the ultimate space vessel.
Our primary source is the 2013 book by Ryuho Okawa. Now, right off the bat in the preface, the author acknowledges that his core premise is going to be incredibly hard to believe for a lot of people. The idea that we can literally sit here on Earth and clearly see the hidden, dark side of the moon, it's a huge claim. Because of that, he essentially invites the reader to just keep an open mind, suspend that disbelief, and simply read through his findings before passing judgment on this wildly unique method of investigation.
So how exactly did he gather this information? Well, on March 12, 2013, Okawa conducted what he called a live remote viewing session. According to the text, by spending anywhere from just a few seconds to about 30 seconds in deep, intense mental focus, he claims to have teleported a part of his spirit, complete with its actual sense of sight, directly to the moon. Imagine it like being a live television reporter, right? But instead of a camera crew broadcasting via satellite, he claims he was broadcasting his visual and sensory experiences back to an audience on Earth in real time. To really understand how the author claims to pull this off, we have to look at the mechanics he defines in the text, which he actually compares directly to Buddha's 6 supernatural powers. He attributes this remote viewing to a fusion of 2 very specific abilities. The first is Jinsoksu, which basically translates to the free, completely unhindered movement of the spirit. The second is Tengansu, which is clairvoyance or an all-seeing visionary power. So the crucial takeaway here is that he's not just seeing from afar like looking through a telescope. The author describes it as literally moving a part of his spiritual body to that location, blending omnipresence with absolute vision. Once he established that spiritual connection, the author didn't just wander around aimlessly. He actually targeted specific coordinates on the far side of the moon. His primary areas of investigation were in and around the Fermi and Tsiolkovsky craters. This targeted approach is super fascinating because it mimics how a traditional scientific reconnaissance mission would work, giving us specific geographical anchors for the extraordinary claims that follow. So what exactly did he claim to find at these coordinates? Well, his first major observation was not just barren rock. He claims he saw massive artificial structures. He describes one of these structures as looking exactly like a giant clamshell. And what's absolutely vital to note here is the camouflage. The text describes these shell-like domes as being colored like yellow soil or sea urchins, which allowed them to blend perfectly into the lunar cliffs to stay hidden from danger. And get this, he claims he actually observed them physically opening and closing. But what is going on inside these heavily camouflaged shell-like domes? The source material gets highly specific here. The author claims these are deeply complex artificial environments. He describes seeing what he calls fetal rooms or incubation chambers. Inside these cave-like domes, there are reportedly rows of egg-shaped objects standing upright. To sustain all of this, the author notes the presence of artificial lighting used to warm and mature these eggs, and surprisingly an absolute abundance of water. It's painted as a fully functional, self-sustaining alien nursery hidden right there in our celestial backyard. Now, obviously, if there's a nursery, someone, or something, must be tending to it, right? The text details encounters with the actual inhabitants of these bases, and let's just say, not all of them were welcoming. Near the Fermi crater, the author claims to have encountered a reptilian or dinosaur-type alien. The source material points out that these beings operate on a very different wavelength than humanity. They are described as highly territorial and potentially very dangerous. The text suggests that to these beings, if humans haven't established clear ownership of a territory, they consider it theirs for the taking. It's a really tense, hostile encounter that frames the dark side of the moon as a fiercely contested frontier. However, in the book's afterword, the author is really careful to point out that not all extraterrestrial life on the moon is hostile. He draws a drastic contrast between 2 different types of beings. On one hand, you have the territorial, dinosaur-type reptilians we just talked about, who are implied to be carnivorous and dangerous to Earthmen.
But on the other hand, the author reports interacting with what he calls goat-type aliens. He describes them as decent, respectable, and generally friendly towards humanity. So the text presents this incredibly complex astropolitical landscape on the moon, filled with diverse species holding very different intentions toward us.
Bringing this narrative back down to Earth, the author makes a really strategic argument in the afterword for why all of this matters to us right now. We all know traditional space exploration requires astronomical budgets and decades of preparation. Because of this, he proposes that extrasensory perception, or ESP, should be adopted as a vital preliminary survey tool for future missions. Think about it. By using remote viewing in this way, he argues that superpowers could drastically reduce preparation time down to literally minutes, save immense amounts of funding, and most importantly, completely avoid putting human astronauts in any physical danger. But to actually unlock this potential, the text argues that humanity needs a fundamental shift in philosophy. The source asserts that our current heavy reliance on pure materialism is basically a dead end for true space exploration. Since materialistic thinking dictates that absolutely nothing can travel faster than the speed of light, we are grounded until we recognize the multidimensional nature of the universe. In this view, spiritual enlightenment is the new science. It's all about aligning our consciousness to the point where we can step into a higher dimension, specifically what the author refers to as the dimension of universal law.
And this framework sets the stage for the absolute climax of the text, where the author reveals the ultimate motivation behind his work. He states that when his spiritual consciousness stepped into this dimension of universal law, he realized his true roots. I want to read this quote directly translated from the afterword. He writes, "I feel it as a reality that I have existed since ancient times as a divine spirit beyond human, and am now temporarily born on Earth." That is a massive claim. He expresses that publishing these remote viewing findings is a crucial step in fulfilling his true cosmic mission, which is waking humanity up to this much larger reality.
And that brings us to the end of our explainer today. We're left with a truly profound question to ponder. Based on the grand vision presented in this source material, what would the future of space exploration actually look like if science and spiritual enlightenment were to merge? What if the strict limitations of rockets and the speed of light were replaced by the boundless reach of human consciousness? Whether you view this text as a literal account or a fascinating thought experiment, it undeniably challenges us to look up at the moon tonight and wonder just how much we still have left to discover out there. Thank you so much for joining me on this mind-expanding journey.
Welcome to this explainer. Today, we are unpacking a truly fascinating and honestly highly unconventional perspective on one of the 20th century's biggest historical moments. I'm talking about the Apollo moon missions. We're diving into the claims made in Ryuho Okawa's book, Remote Viewing, The Dark Side of the Moon. Now, I'll be walking you through the author's highly alternative assertions about the real reason humanity just abruptly stopped going to the moon. Remember, our goal here is to impartially explore the source material and its unique claims. So no matter where you stand on the subject, buckle up, because it is a wild ride. I mean, have you ever actually stopped to wonder why we just quit going to the moon? It's a completely fair question, isn't it? After this massive, intense space race that literally captivated the entire globe, lunar exploration just halted. It's an undeniable historical anomaly. We went from taking one giant leap for mankind to seemingly just turning our backs on our closest celestial neighbor. This abrupt end sets up a fascinating historical mystery, and, well, it's the exact starting point for the investigation in our source material today.
So think about the timeline for a second. The accepted historical narrative tells us that funding cuts and fading public interest are what killed the Apollo program. But our source asks us to look a little closer. We had the historic first landing in 1969, right? Then, in 1970, that near-fatal mysterious explosion on Apollo 13. Finally, Apollo 17 in 1972 marked the very last landing. But here's the crucial part. Missions up to Apollo 20 were already planned. They were in the pipeline. The author asserts that the program wasn't just gradually defunded, it was prematurely and urgently terminated.
According to the text, incidents like the mysterious oxygen tank explosion on Apollo 13, which obviously forced the crew to abandon their landing, and that sudden, definitive cancellation after Apollo 17, they aren't just a string of bad luck. They aren't just budgetary red tape. The author suggests these incidents actually point to a terrifying hidden narrative. What if humanity didn't just lose interest? What if we were, essentially, warned away?
Section 1. Investigating the unseen. The method of remote viewing.
Okay, so since booking a commercial flight to the moon isn't exactly an option just yet, the author turned to a highly unconventional investigative method to explore this hidden narrative. Back on March 12, 2013, a live remote viewing session was actually recorded at the Happy Science headquarters. The author claims to have used a specific spiritual capability to project a portion of his consciousness 380,000 kilometers across space. He did this publicly with an audience, claiming to instantly travel to and explore the dark side of the moon. The side that is permanently hidden from Earth's view.
Section 2. What lurks on the dark side?
During this session, the author zeroes right in on a very precise location. He targets two massive impact sites on the far side, known as the Tsiolkovsky and Fermi craters. And according to the reading, this isn't just barren rock and space dust. No, this specific area is allegedly home to hidden, artificial structures and highly advanced alien bases.
To really drive home the historical mystery of this claim, the author brings up the legendary science fiction writer Arthur C. Clarke. Clarke actually once wrote about the Tsiolkovsky Crater, expressing this profound sense of dread. He literally stated that we simply do not know what is lurking around its vast expanse. The source highlights this to suggest that even brilliant, imaginative minds kind of sensed there was an inconvenient truth hidden in the shadows of that specific lunar spot.
Section 3. The alien's true purpose.
So if there are indeed bases up there, what exactly are these extraterrestrial beings doing right next door to Earth? Well, the text gets remarkably specific here. It categorizes several different types of extraterrestrial entities allegedly present on the moon. It mentions goat-type beings operating a forward base, entities from the Sirius star system that resemble lobsters and scorpions, and even beings from Essassani, who purportedly communicate with Earth through spiritual channelers. According to the author, these diverse groups aren't just passing through, they're maintaining an active, multi-species outpost. And they aren't just peacefully observing us either. The source asserts that these entities are actively studying human genetics, they're gathering millions of patterns of human behavioral data, and they're even utilizing advanced transfer devices to abduct humans. The overarching claim here is one of preparation. They're intensely studying us in order to assimilate or at least seamlessly interact with humanity. In fact, the author explicitly describes these lunar bases as a learning center and a rehabilitation outpost. The really fascinating idea presented here is that before interacting with Earth, or even before their souls reincarnate as actual humans on our planet, these extraterrestrials use the moon as this sort of acclimatization zone. They study our biological and behavioral makeup to literally learn how to exist among us.
Section 4. The covered-up inconvenient truth.
Now this brings us to the dramatic intersection of these alleged alien bases and our very own Apollo astronauts. And this is really the crux of the author's narrative. The Apollo astronauts actually witnessed inconvenient truths that they were never meant to see. The claim is that they encountered artificial structures, UFO oases, and extraterrestrial beings right there on the dark side of the moon. The text claims this shock was so profound that, and I quote, "the majority of those who came must have gone mad." Encountering these terrifying entities face-to-face completely broke the astronauts psychologically, and this massive cover-up of the facts is framed as the true catalyst for the sudden end of the Apollo program. The book even goes as far as suggesting a shockingly alternative history regarding the origins of the space race itself. It asserts that President John F. Kennedy didn't initiate the Apollo program simply as a geopolitical flex to beat the Soviets. Instead, the text claims he was driven by this desperate, secretive desire to access this pre-existing alien base on the moon.
Ultimately, the author argues that the abrupt cancellation of the Apollo missions was the direct result of this terrifying encounter. The astronauts and the government realized there was a vast, completely insurmountable technological gap between humanity and these beings. The hidden truth, the source claims, was simply too dangerous. It forced humanity into a terrified silence, prompting an immediate and permanent retreat from lunar exploration, just to hide this inconvenient reality from the public.
Which leaves us here. We've explored the highly alternative claims presented in Remote Viewing the Dark Side of the Moon. The source paints a picture of a universe that is far more crowded and perhaps far more calculating than our history books suggest. So, whether you view this as a compelling spiritual investigation or purely as a fascinating piece of science fiction, I want to leave you with this provocative thought. If the moon is truly a watchtower, as this book claims, who is observing us right now? Thank you for joining me on this explainer. Until next time, keep questioning what you see.
Welcome back, everyone, to another explainer.
Today, we're diving into something truly fascinating. We're unpacking a published remote viewing session conducted by Ryuho Okawa. Now, regardless of where you stand on esoteric practices, you have to admit, this text presents an incredibly gripping and highly detailed narrative about what supposedly exists on the far side of the moon. So let's just jump right in and visualize exactly what this alleged extraterrestrial outpost looks like.
It's a question that's captivated us for decades, right? Ever since we realized the moon is tidally locked, forever hiding one of its hemispheres from our view, we've wondered what's back there. Well, according to the source material we're exploring today, the answer absolutely isn't just barren rock and dead impact craters. This remote viewing session claims to completely pierce that veil, taking us on a psychic journey straight to a heavily camouflaged, highly active extraterrestrial frontline base.
But before we get to the wild stuff, let's ground this in actual lunar geography. The text doesn't just point vaguely into the dark. It zeroes right in on a very specific real-world location. We're talking about the Tsiolkovsky Crater, which sits right next door to the Fermi Crater. In the remote viewing session, the author directs his focus intensely onto the rugged, uneven terrain surrounding this massive impact site.
So as the author's psychic perspective zooms into the crater, the text describes this bizarre visual transition. Imagine you're looking at what seem like normal, bumpy lunar mountains, and then suddenly you realize one of these mountains isn't a mountain at all. It's an artificially constructed dome. It's a massive structure purposely designed to blend in and completely evade detection from any satellites we might have orbiting the moon. The imagery the author uses here is so specific and, honestly, deeply strange. The structure is described as looking just like a giant shell, specifically an Akoya oyster or a clamshell nestled right into the steep lunar cliffs. The text notes that this outer shell has a yellowish-brown or ochre color, kind of like a sea urchin, which makes it the absolute perfect camouflage against the stark, dusty lunar landscape.
And here's the crazy part. This massive oyster-like structure isn't even static. According to the viewing session, the top right side of the shell can actually open and close. When it senses danger or just needs to stay hidden, it snaps completely shut, perfectly mimicking a natural, jagged mountain peak. It's only when the base partially opens up that an observer would even realize it's a massive, hollowed-out facility. Okay, so what's inside? As the psychic vision penetrates the shell, things get incredibly complex. The author describes seeing a giant, spinning circular disc fitted perfectly into the lower half of the structure. Moving further inward, there's this vast network of straight pathways and grand spiral staircases winding outward. And right there in the very center, a gigantic power source driving the entire hidden operation. So we have a massively engineered, camouflaged oyster base hiding in a real lunar crater, which naturally leads to the most critical question in the text. Who built this thing? Who was actually walking up those spiral staircases? Well, the remote viewing session details a direct encounter with one of the entities acting as a guide for the facility. And let me tell you, the description is unforgettable. This brings us to the real core of the author's findings. The frontline base is managed by what the book categorizes as black goat-type extraterrestrials. It's a striking image that totally throws out the typical gray alien trope we're all so used to seeing in pop culture. This is the exact entity that steps forward in the text to act as the psychic guide. And we absolutely have to talk about the sheer scale of these beings. The text explicitly notes they are a staggering 5 meters tall. To put that into perspective for you, that is over 16 feet tall. A normal human being would barely reach the knee of one of these guys when standing right next to it. So picture this, based on the source. You have an entity standing completely upright on 2 legs, entirely outfitted in a sleek, futuristic spacesuit. But its head? It has the face of a goat, covered in black hair, complete with backwards curving pattern horns. The text makes it very clear, though, that this isn't a literal animal. It is a highly advanced, humanoid-structured being. It just happens to possess distinctly goat-like facial features.
Oh, and they are definitely not alone. When asked about the population of this specific base near the Tsiolkovsky Crater, the entity reveals there are approximately 2,000 of these black goat-type individuals stationed there. Think about that for a second. That implies a massive, highly organized logistical operation. It's not just a tiny observation post. It's a fully staffed, functioning lunar colony.
Now, given their intimidating appearance and towering 16-foot stature, you might expect the text to describe them as a hostile, invading force. I mean, it sounds terrifying, right? But here is the fascinating twist in the narrative. The text describes their operations and motives as highly moderate. This massive camouflage dome isn't a staging ground for a planetary takeover. Actually, it functions much more like a cosmic rest stop and a learning center. The source breaks down the base's functions, and they are surprisingly practical. It essentially serves as a transit hub. The base is a place for energy replenishment, and it acts as a staging area for final adjustments before these beings travel down to Earth. It also serves as a rehabilitation and study center. It's basically a rest stop for entities to recover, debrief, and learn before or after their missions.
The text really emphasizes this moderate operational model, pushing back hard against our usual sci-fi fears. It highlights that these beings are actually quite cooperative, using this frontline outpost purely for logistical purposes. According to the remote viewing, they essentially operate as part of a larger organized network of extraterrestrial intelligence that simply monitors our planet.
Furthermore, the session clarifies their overall stance toward humanity. The text indicates that these black goat-type aliens are part of a broader faction focused on Earth's defense and observation. So yes, they are monitoring us, but according to this source material, they are positioned as a protective, or at the very least neutral, observational force, just quietly maintaining this hidden way station out of our sight.
Which leaves us with a truly compelling thought experiment to close on. We've just mapped out the text's claims of a giant, oyster shell camouflaged base powered by a massive spinning disk, populated by 2,016-foot-tall goat-headed aliens, acting essentially as a cosmic truck stop and rehab center just over the lunar horizon. If such an advanced, entirely moderate logistical presence were ever definitively proven to be resting just out of sight, how in the world would humanity react? It completely flips all our preconceived notions of what extraterrestrial contact might actually look like. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the source material. Stay curious, keep learning, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.
Welcome back to another explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a truly wild and meticulously detailed document. We're looking at a series of claims drawn from Ryuho Okawa's remote viewing sessions, specifically what the author alleges is hiding right now on the far side of the moon. Whether you're a hardcore follower of extraterrestrial theories or you just love unpacking a fascinating narrative, this visual dossier is going to give us a direct look into a very specific, highly unusual lunar mystery. Okay, let's dive into this. To really grasp what we're looking at today, we first have to understand the methodology the source claims to use. According to the author, these observations weren't made through massive physical telescopes. Instead, they were made through remote viewing. The text literally describes projecting a part of the spirit body 370,000 kilometers away to directly explore the hidden realities of the lunar surface. It's an incredibly unconventional lens for sure, but as you'll see, it yields some astonishingly precise architectural and biological claims. And here is our setting, the dark side of the moon. It's massive, it's heavily cratered, and because it's tidally locked with our planet, it always faces away from Earth. It's basically the ultimate blind spot. According to the text we're analyzing, this desolate, eerie, and completely isolated environment makes it the absolute perfect staging ground for something entirely unknown to humanity. Section 1. The method and the location, pinpointing the Fermi crater. If you look at the lunar surface, there's the Tsiolkovsky Crater, and right next to it is our primary target, the Fermi crater. The source material is remarkably specific about this location. It claims that right in this exact vicinity, near Fermi, there is a highly anomalous, heavily camouflaged base. Now, at first glance, the text notes that the area just looks like a bumpy mountain, or a steep cliff. But upon closer remote inspection, the author describes it like this. It looks like a half-open clam, making it look like a steep cliff or a mountain to act as protective coloring. It's completely designed to blend in seamlessly with that cratered, rocky lunar terrain. Now, what's really interesting about this is the sheer level of architectural detail the source provides. I mean, this isn't just some vague shape. The text breaks down the facility like an actual blueprint. You've got that bumpy, mountain-like exterior for camouflage. Then you've got this clamshell design that literally opens and closes when danger is near. Once you're inside, the author describes massive spiral ramps circling all the way from the bottom up to the top. And right in the middle, a central command tower that apparently acts as the facility's primary power source. It's described as a highly sophisticated frontline base. The text actually compares the design philosophy of this space to an ocean floor creature. It uses protective colorings so that to any passing spacecraft, it just looks like the standard lunar surface. But this camouflage isn't just for hiding, right? The source specifically notes it's built this way to avoid being targeted, while allowing the inhabitants to launch swift, sudden attacks. Which, of course, brings us to the obvious question: who exactly is living inside? Section 2. The entity encountering the reptilians. And this brilliantly illustrates what the author encountered. Based on the remote viewing descriptions, this is a captured reptilian entity. The source describes these extraterrestrials as highly aggressive, incredibly dangerous, and possessing a deeply intimidating physical presence. Let's break down the biology here, because the physical traits reported in the dossier are super specific. They're bipedal, meaning they walk upright on 2 legs. Their hands have 3 to 4 fingers, and fascinatingly, the text notes these fingers are webbed. The author suggests this points to an amphibious origin, a species originally adapted for planets with a lot of water, even though that webbing might shrink in super dry environments like the moon. They also have a distinctly reptilian, almost dinosaur-like skin texture. And to top it all off, the text explicitly points out a truly terrifying set of teeth inside an elongated jaw. Moving on to Section 3. The threat: advanced lunar technology. I want you to really think about this number. 250 kilometers per hour. That's over 150 miles per hour. According to the remote viewing session, this is the sheer speed at which these highly unique entities are moving across the rough, cratered surface of the moon. So how are they moving that incredibly fast? Well, the text claims they're riding highly advanced one-person lunar rovers. Think about humanity's own lunar rovers for a second, which basically crawled along the surface at a fraction of that pace. The source describes these reptilian riders just zipping across the uneven ground at staggering speeds, stopping on a dime. It paints a vivid picture of a species with complete and utter mastery over their technological environment. Let's move to Section 4 and see how this all builds up. Cosmic philosophy, the space travel requisite. Here is where it gets highly philosophical. The text states that no matter how aggressive, meat-eating, or seemingly ruthless a species might be, yes, even these dangerous reptilians, interstellar space travel is fundamentally impossible without a high level of spiritual enlightenment. The source argues that to navigate a multidimensional universe, a species actually has to understand and believe in the underlying energy of the cosmos, whether you call that the creator, God, or just the fundamental force of the universe. It's a really fascinating paradox, isn't it? Having this incredibly advanced technology and vicious behavior, yet being totally bound by a mandatory cosmic spirituality? So, the crucial takeaway is this. If we take the claims of this remote viewing dossier as they are presented, the universe is filled with both profound threats and profound spiritual prerequisites. And that leaves us with an incredibly compelling question to ponder. If advanced space travel inherently requires a deep understanding of cosmic energy, what does that mean for humanity's own technological and spiritual evolution as we reach further out into the stars? Well, I hope this structured look at the Fermi Crater dossier helped you grasp the fascinating details of this unique source material. Keep learning, keep questioning, and we'll catch you in the next explainer.
Welcome back, focused learners, to another explainer. Today, we're diving into a source text that is, well, it's pretty wild. It literally left me speechless the first time I read it. We're looking at documents claiming to reveal what's actually hiding on the far side of the moon and how it directly ties into Earth's cosmic defense. We're talking secret lunar bases, extraterrestrial intervention, the whole shebang. It is a wildly fascinating ride through a very specific perspective, so let's just jump right in.
But before we head to the moon, let's start right here on Earth. Remember February 2013, the Chelyabinsk meteor explosion over Russia? We've all seen the dashcam footage, that blinding flash, the massive shockwave blowing out windows across the city. Now, the standard scientific consensus says it was just a natural space rock burning up in our atmosphere. But the source text we're unpacking today, it pitches a radically different, incredibly detailed alternative for exactly why that meteor exploded, when, and where it did.
To wrap our heads around this alternative explanation, we have to look at how the author claims to have gotten this information. No telescopes, no satellites. The text states this was all done through a spiritual technique called remote viewing. The author asserts that they essentially projected a piece of their consciousness, their spirit, about 370,000 kilometers through the void of space to get a first-hand look at the dark side of the moon. That is the core premise here, using human consciousness as an investigative tool to see what conventional science can't.
And here's what's really fascinating about the physical setting. This wasn't some solitary, hidden event. The source provides photographs from March 12, 2013 showing a highly documented, public recording of this remote viewing session at the Happy Science headquarters. You have the author seated in front of monitors, a panel of interviewers, and a live audience. The text uses this to ground the esoteric claim, basically treating the remote viewing as a live investigative broadcast.
Section 1. The investigation begins. Anomalies in the lunar craters. Let's leave Earth behind and head for the Moon. The remote viewing didn't just wander around aimlessly. It was highly targeted. The session zoomed straight in on the desolate, pockmarked geography of the Moon's dark side, specifically focusing on two massive impact craters, Fermi, and right next to it, the basin-like Tsiolkovsky Crater. The interviewers and the author discussed the structure of this specific crater, using reference materials to guide that spiritual projection to these exact coordinates.
And right smack in the dead center of its Tsiolkovsky crater, they spot an anomaly. Now, some traditional observers have called this an island or a central peak. But during the session, the author explicitly points this out as looking completely unnatural. It's not described as a random pile of rocks. The text claims it's something structural, something that immediately stood out as a highly unusual presence sitting in the middle of a barren lunar landscape. Which brings us to a mind-bending description in the text. Upon closer psychic inspection, the author says this isn't a natural geological formation at all. It's described as a massive energy source loaded with mechanical elements. And get this, the text claims this facility possesses a will of its own. It hints at a highly advanced artificial intelligence or a conscious operational purpose, generating massive amounts of energy, potentially even mining lunar resources to power itself.
Section 2. A frontline base for Earth defense. So, what is this mechanical energy source actually for?
The source text makes a huge leap here. It claims this lunar facility is actually a forward operating base run by highly advanced extraterrestrials, and their main mission is Earth defense. Which brings us right back to our original question about that Russian meteor. Let's look at the timeline. February 15, 2013, just weeks before this public viewing session, a 17-meter meteor hurtles into our atmosphere. It's on a collision course, and then suddenly it explodes high over the Euro region, preventing what would have been a catastrophic, world-altering direct impact. To put this danger into perspective, we have to talk about the speed, Mach 50. The text heavily emphasizes this number to highlight the terrifying kinetic energy of this rock. At 50 times the speed of sound, a direct strike from a 17-meter meteor would absolutely devastate a populated area. The author argues that a solid rock moving at that insane velocity, just exploding naturally mid-air, is highly improbable, which sets the stage perfectly for their extraterrestrial explanation. To back up this claim, the text points to visual evidence supposedly taken from Russian television broadcasts of the event. It claims this shows a high-speed projectile or craft intercepting the meteor from behind and piercing right through it. According to the source, this ultra-high-speed meteor was deliberately crushed, and its orbit was radically changed mid-air, thanks to advanced alien technology originating from that lunar base. The text insists they stepped in on a defense mission to save Earth from destruction. The text uses this incredibly vivid analogy for the interception, describing it as being shattered in an instant, like a sword's quick draw. I mean, think about it. The author points out that human technology literally cannot analyze, track, and shoot down an object moving at Mach 50 in a matter of seconds. So the text presents this immediate pulverization as absolute proof of a superior, non-human intelligence acting rapidly and decisively to neutralize the threat.
Section 3. The Planetary Federation's intervention. So, who exactly is supposedly doing the intercepting?
The source material doesn't just say aliens did it and leave it there. It attributes this life-saving intervention to a specific group it calls the Planetary Federation or Space Alliance. Operating out of bases like the one in the Tsiolkovsky Crater, the text claims they act as a cosmic deterrent. They don't stop every single space babble, but they deflect massive, life-threatening meteors to ensure humanity actually has the chance to survive and evolve. They are essentially our guardians working in the shadows, which is certainly a comforting thought.
It is a breathtaking narrative, isn't it? The source text takes a real-world event, the Chelyabinsk meteor, and weaves it into this massive cosmic story of spiritual projection, hidden lunar bases, and a highly advanced federation protecting us from the void of space. Whether you view this text as a literal truth, a fascinating piece of modern mythology, or just an elaborate thought experiment, it really forces us to look up at the night sky and ask, are we truly alone in the universe, or is a cosmic federation quietly watching over us from the dark side of the moon?
That's the incredible question this source leaves us with. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, focused learners. Keep asking questions.
All right, let's dive right into today's explainer and unpack a highly controversial, super esoteric text that frames our entire world and literally everything that happens on it as an extraterrestrial civilization experiment. Today we're digging into a translated source titled Remote Viewing: The Dark Side of the Moon. Now, this text presents a deeply unconventional worldview claiming to reveal secrets completely hidden from humanity. We're going to strictly examine the claims made here, basically stepping inside the author's framework to understand how they view human history, because to them it's not a natural progression at all. Instead, it's a heavily monitored cosmic laboratory.
So, according to the source material, we really need to flip our entire perspective upside down. Imagine for a second that Earth isn't just our planet, right? The text claims it's actually a testing ground, closely watched and managed by highly advanced alien entities. It essentially asks us to suspend our conventional understanding of history and biology, proposing that the major events shaping humanity are really just controlled variables in an ongoing, multi-generational study being run by beings from beyond our world.
The author hits us with this core premise right out of the gate. They paint this picture of a totally orchestrated reality where our existence is heavily monitored and manipulated from the shadows. The text explicitly uses the phrase experiment site to describe Earth. In this framework, human bodies are essentially just vessels. The experiences we go through, the struggles, the triumphs, the very act of living, they're all just part of a cosmic training program or trial. The extraterrestrials are depicted as observers and instigators, basically just watching how these souls perform under the very specific conditions of Earth.
Okay, so how do these entities actually operate? The text breaks it down into two totally distinct methods of intervention. On one side, we have macro-level events. These are massive, global occurrences, like the deliberate release of viruses for population control. And then on the other side, we have micro-level interventions. These are deeply personal, involving the abduction of individuals for genetic harvesting and physical experimentation. The author posits that both of these scales are absolutely crucial for the aliens to gather the data and the physical resources they need from our world.
Section 1. Population Control and Viruses.
Let's start with that macro level first and see how the text explains some of the absolute darkest chapters in human history, recontextualizing global pandemics within this extraterrestrial framework. The author takes a known historical tragedy, the Black Death, and frames it not as a natural pandemic, but as a calculated extraterrestrial experiment. The text claims that historical plagues were essentially early tests. They weren't accidents of sanitation or nature, but intentional introductions of pathogens to observe exactly how humanity reacts when faced with a sudden catastrophic population collapse.
The source material actually claims these massive mass casualty events are deliberate tests to gauge our resilience. It's treating human survival almost like a cosmic game of poker. By introducing a virus that humanity has literally no natural immunity to, these observers are allegedly just watching to see our response. Will the population be entirely wiped out, or will we adapt, develop medical countermeasures, and somehow survive? The text describes this as a brutal but highly calculated civilization experiment to test the absolute limits of our species.
And the author brings this right up to modern times, suggesting that viruses like AIDS are introduced to observe whether the human race can adapt today or if it will be wiped out. The text explicitly names AIDS as a contemporary version of the plague experiment. It argues that unseen forces release these modern viruses to continue challenging our medical infrastructure and our biological durability, just constantly gathering data on our survival mechanisms.
Section 2. Genetic Experiments and Abductions.
All right, zooming in from massive global pandemics, the text shifts focus to the micro level, the deeply personal and physical violations of the individual. This is where the source explains the terrifying accounts of alien encounters. Now, we really need to define abduction exactly as it is framed in this book. It is explicitly described as a biological harvesting operation, rather than just capturing humans for casual study. The author insists that when individuals are taken, it is for a very specific utilitarian purpose, to extract human genetic material, specifically eggs and sperm. They aren't just observing us, they are physically taking the building blocks of our reproduction.
According to the text, these entities are basically running a massive laboratory to study how humans live, adapt, and reproduce on this planet. They're deeply interested in human ecology. By conducting crossbreeding experiments, they are trying to figure out how to modify or create a physical form that can actually thrive in Earth-specific environment. They're analyzing us from every possible angle to decode the secrets of our biological success.
And the methodology they supposedly use? It sounds straight out of a sci-fi movie. The source details conversations asserting that primitive teleportation tech is used to pull subjects directly into these cosmic research facilities. Humans are supposedly captured using transfer devices, beaming them directly onto spacecraft. Once there, they undergo these intense genetic and biological studies, acting as unwitting donors to a massive overarching scientific endeavor.
Section 3. Creation of Next Earthlings. So all of this really brings us to the ultimate question, right? Why? Why harvest this material and run these global experiments in the first place? What's the end game here? Well, the text lays out a clear, multi-generational agenda. They are systematically extracting our traits to construct the perfect biological vessel for themselves. It's a literal step-by-step process. First, they gather the raw material through abductions. Then, they study it to understand Earth's harsh environment. Finally, they use that knowledge to engineer a totally new type of body, a hybrid or modified form that the text refers to as the next Earthling.
The author claims that without proper physical adaptation, alien souls simply cannot handle being on Earth, meaning they are using our DNA to build a bridge for their own planetary migration. And the source notes a really fascinating detail here. Apparently in the past, when these entities tried to come to Earth in bodies that weren't adapted, many of them actually went mad. To survive here, they realize they can't just take over as they are. They absolutely must absorb our genetic traits and literally build a new physical form that can withstand our world, paving the way for a mass migration.
Leaving you to ponder this incredibly esoteric worldview, we really have to ask, if we are just subjects in an ongoing biological trial, what exactly happens when the results are finally in? If viruses are just tests of our endurance and our DNA is simply raw material being used to engineer our replacements, what is the ultimate fate of the current human race once the next Earthling is actually ready to take the stage? It's a chilling paradigm for sure, one that forces us to question our agency, leaving us to wonder if we're the masters of our own destiny or simply an outdated control group in a cosmic laboratory.
All right, welcome back to another explainer. Today we are taking a seriously fascinating and, I mean, highly unusual tour. We're unpacking a text that makes some incredibly specific esoteric claims about what's really going on inside our moon. So buckle up, because the details we're about to explore together are literally out of this world. Our entire expedition today is guided by just one source, a book called Remote Viewing the Dark Side of the Moon by Ryuho Okawa. This text claims to basically pull back the curtain on our lunar neighbor, but through a very unconventional method. We're going to impartially map out exactly what this book presents, letting the visuals guide us through the author's highly detailed and honestly deeply unusual claims. Which brings us to the big question, right? What is actually hiding beneath the moon's craters? You know, we're all so used to seeing the moon as this barren, gray, lifeless rock just floating out there in space. But what surreal secrets might be hidden just out of humanity's sight? This specific remote viewing session paints a picture that is so detailed and so completely contrary to our standard scientific consensus that it's absolutely captivating to break down and explore. So let's set the stage. How was this information allegedly gathered? Well, the source material documents a live session that took place on March 12, 2013. The author claims to have actually projected his consciousness, like a spiritual part of himself, hundreds of thousands of miles away, landing directly on the dark side of the moon. What we're digging into today are the exact step-by-step findings he reported during that very session. Section 1. Mare Moscovienses, the underground city. Okay, let's dive right in. The text points us to a very specific location, a lunar basin known as Mare Moscoviense, or the Sea of Moscow. But the real action, it's deep beneath that basin. The descent into this alleged city is described so vividly. You go past these steep, plunging cliffs, moving deep, deep underground until everything just opens up into this highly structured, arcade-like underground city. Imagine a massive, cavernous space with sprawling architecture that feels almost like a subterranean shopping mall. It's described as this bustling environment completely sealed off and hidden right beneath the rocky lunar exterior. Now, naturally, a city needs citizens, right? Well, during this session, the author actually states, "I'm starting to see creatures with heads like giraffes, Dinger-Kirin-type." I mean, the text goes on to describe these bizarre alien entities with giraffe-like faces, literal bumps protruding from their heads, and very visible ears. It's an incredibly specific, kind of startling image of extraterrestrial life just hanging out in our cosmic backyard. Section 2. Alien hydroponic underground farms. But how exactly does a society of giraffe-like aliens survive deep underground on a totally barren moon? The source describes a remarkably specific hydroponic setup. We're talking strictly soil-free agriculture, using these cylindrical cups filled with flowing nutrient-rich water, all entirely bathed in artificial light. It's a wild juxtaposition, isn't it? You've got this totally alien setting with giraffe-headed beings, yet the farming method they're using is something we're actually super familiar with right here on Earth. And this brilliantly illustrates just how surreal these claims get. Grown right there in these underground lunar farms, under those artificial lights, are crops that are described as looking a lot like palm trees. And alongside those, they're growing super familiar items: bananas, tomatoes, pineapples, sweet potatoes, and leafy greens. The text even mentions they heavily process the beans and potatoes to make this doughy substitute for bread. The sheer contrast here, vegetarian giraffe aliens cultivating palm-like crops and baking bread beneath the Sea of Moscow, is just an absolutely fascinating visual. It's really important to emphasize the mechanics of this lunar farming too. This is strictly artificial hydroponics versus soil agriculture. While they're supposedly growing familiar, earthy items like sweet potatoes and tomatoes, the text is absolutely adamant. They do this entirely without a single grain of dirt. Because the environment outside their arcade-like city is literally just solid rock, they rely 100% on that continuous artificial flow of nutrient water to survive.
Section 3. A vegetarian diet with a twist.
So let's see how this builds, because, well, there's a very strange, bizarre twist to their diet. The text describes these aliens as essentially vegetarian, but their lifestyle includes a very specific and honestly quite startling exception to the rule. According to the remote viewing session, they do consume meat, but only from one highly specific animal. The text describes this creature as a cross between a squirrel and a miniature boar. It directly calls it the Risui inoshisi, or squirrel boar. Just when you thought the claims couldn't get any more unusual than lunar hydroponic pineapples, boom, we are introduced to the squirrel boar. But why on Earth, or I guess why on the moon, do these otherwise vegetarian aliens eat this specific creature? The text explains this deeply esoteric philosophy behind what we can call a happy livestock life cycle. You see, these squirrel boars aren't just kept in pens. According to the source, they are actually given an education up to the intelligence level of a 3-year-old human. They're raised in this joyful, kindergarten-like environment where they just play and live happily. And finally, they are cultivated to pass away completely peacefully without experiencing any pain, fear, or suffering whatsoever. Which leaves us with the text's deeply bizarre, yet fascinating underlying logic. This alien society supposedly operates on the core belief that eating meat from unhappy, frightened, or suffering animals physically brings misfortune to the person eating it. Because of that, they only consume creatures that have lived completely happy, peaceful lives. So I'm going to leave you with this provocative philosophical question raised by the text. Does consuming unhappiness truly bring misfortune? It is a strange, surreal concept from an alleged underground lunar city, but it's definitely a question that forces you to think a bit differently about how we treat the world around us. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and as always, keep questioning the universe. Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a seriously fascinating intersection of ideas. We are looking at source texts that completely bridge the gap between astrophysics, human spiritual evolution, and the future of interstellar travel. And the core argument here is pretty radical. It proposes that reaching the stars isn't just about building bigger rockets or better engines. Not at all. It suggests that actual physical space exploration is fundamentally impossible unless it's paired with a massive evolution of the human spirit. We're going on a journey today, from a localized psychic experiment all the way to a total redefinition of physics and our place in the cosmos. Here is our roadmap for today. We'll be hitting 1. Remote viewing the moon, 2. The limits of material science, 3. Enlightenment as a science, 4. Faster than light navigation, and 5. A cosmic experimental ground. Let's jump right in. All right, kicking things off with Section 1, Remote Viewing the Moon. So, everything we're about to unpack actually stems from one highly specific foundational event. On March 12, 2013, a public remote viewing session was conducted by Ryuho Okawa. And according to the source texts, during this session, the author purportedly projected a portion of his spirit body roughly 370,000 kilometers away, literally all the way to the dark side of the moon. And the wild part? He did this right in front of cameras, an interviewer, and a live audience. He was essentially reporting back what he saw in real time. Almost like a TV anchor broadcasting live from a remote location. The text uses this extraordinary claim as the ultimate jumping-off point to explain how moving across vast cosmic distances is even possible in the first place. Moving right along to Section 2, the limits of material science. Now, you might naturally be wondering, if the human mind can supposedly travel 370,000 kilometers in a split second, why on earth is our physical technology still so agonizingly slow? Well, the text zeroes in on the answer with this exact quote: "Materialistic thinking cannot exceed the speed of light." The author is arguing that as long as humanity believes this three-dimensional material world is all there is, the speed of light is going to remain this absolute, unbreakable brick wall. The text is incredibly firm on this point. To achieve spaceflight or faster-than-light travel, it is absolutely necessary to have way more than just material or technological advancement. And that brings us to this core clash of paradigms. On one side, you have standard 3D materialism. It's totally focused on physical matter, it generally denies the spiritual realm, and because of that, it's firmly restricted by the speed of light. But on the flip side, the text introduces multidimensional knowledge. This is a worldview that actively acknowledges higher spiritual dimensions and the multidimensional structure of the cosmos. The author's point is that unless we abandon strict materialism and fully embrace this multidimensional knowledge, humanity is simply never going to unlock true interstellar travel. It's not pitched as a fun alternative theory, it's an absolute prerequisite. Which leads us perfectly into Section 3, Enlightenment as a science. Okay, so if multidimensional knowledge is the key, how exactly do you get it? Well, the source material completely redefines a word we usually associate with ancient philosophy or monks. Here, enlightenment, or satori in Japanese, is not just some abstract religious or moral concept. The author explicitly defines it as a required, hard science for space travel. It's framed as a highly practical discipline used to elevate the mind so a spacefarer can literally tune their consciousness to multidimensional wavelength levels. Think of it like turning the dial on a radio. To fly a hyper-advanced spacecraft, the text suggests the pilot's mind first has to operate at a higher dimensional frequency. And this boils down to some very specific, actionable prerequisites for these cosmic pilots. The text lays out a checklist. First, science and religion have to progress simultaneously. They are basically two sides of the exact same coin. Second, travelers have to understand that the physical world and all matter were originally materialized by divine light or thought. Third, they absolutely must acknowledge that multidimensional cosmic structure we talked about. And fourth, they have to attain intense mental harmony and control. Without mastering this spiritual baseline, the text claims, a species is fundamentally disqualified from ever navigating the multidimensional cosmos. All right, on to Section 4, faster-than-light navigation. So now that we've got the spiritual requirements down, how does the actual physics of this work? Fair warning, this is where the source material gets highly specific and honestly, a bit mind-bending regarding the mechanics of UFOs. The author claims that to exceed the speed of light and enter that higher dimensional realm, a literal physical transformation has to take place. During transit, both the spacecraft itself and the biological bodies of the crew are completely disassembled at the subatomic level into photons, pure particles of light. So step-by-step, faster-than-light travel looks like this according to the text. Step 1, spiritually acknowledge the multidimensional structure to even access it. Step 2, use intense mental control to allow the ship and the bodies inside to decompose into light particles. But step 3 is the real kicker. Once you arrive at your destination as a wave of photons, how on earth do you become solid again? Well, the text states that reintegrating your physical form requires immense spiritual power, specifically focused will and intention. If a being isn't highly enlightened, they literally cannot put themselves back together. And that is exactly why mere machines can't make this journey alone. Building on that wild concept, the author notes that this level of spiritual mastery basically acts as an equation for time manipulation. When enlightenment reaches a certain critical mass, the text argues it actually grants the ability to control time itself. By shrinking distance and manipulating time, advanced beings can instantly cross the universe. They completely bypass the decades or centuries that a strictly 3D, material-powered journey would take. Basically, the science of the soul becomes the science of bending space-time. And finally, Section 5, a cosmic experimental ground. If everything we just talked about is true, it begs a massive question about us, right here on Earth. The text frames our planet in a very specific, deliberate way, calling it a civilization experiment or a training ground. According to the source, highly advanced extraterrestrial beings don't just see Earth as some random rock in space. They see it as a deliberate, curated spiritual classroom. What's really fascinating about this whole training ground concept is the cosmic implication behind it. The author explains that souls from all across the universe come here, inhabit human bodies, and undergo spiritual development. But there's a strict boundary in place. Because multidimensional space travel fundamentally requires a deep understanding of divine energy and requires you to have that mental harmony and enlightenment, savage or spiritually unevolved beings are naturally barred from making the trip. Think of it as the universe having a built-in security system. If your civilization hasn't evolved enough to understand love, harmony, and multidimensionality, you simply can't unlock the physics required to leave your solar system. You're confined to the sandbox until you learn the curriculum. Which leaves us with a pretty profound final thought for this explainer. Based on the framework laid out in these texts, that reaching the stars is absolutely dependent on our multidimensional knowledge and spiritual enlightenment, rather than just building bigger engines. Is humanity actually ready to leave its experimental ground? Are we cultivating the mental harmony needed to traverse the cosmos? Or are we still way too bound by materialistic thinking? It's a genuinely fascinating lens through which to view our future in space. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I hope this leaves you with some fresh, exciting questions about the incredible link between our minds and the universe itself.